12 men were handpicked by Jesus Christ himself. 12 men watched him heal the blind, raise the dead, calm a storm with his voice. And one of those 12, not a stranger, not an enemy who infiltrated the group, but a trusted friend who held their shared money and walked beside them for 3 years, sold him for the price of a slave. This isn't the story of an obvious villain who was always going to betray him. That version is too easy, and it isn't what the Gospels actually show us. This is the story of a man who got closer to God than almost anyone in human history ever has, and still walked away. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how that happened, hour by hour, choice by choice. Let's begin. Before betrayal, before silver, before any of it, there was a calling. Luke's Gospel tells us that before Jesus selected his 12 apostles, he spent the entire night on a mountainside in prayer. Not a brief moment of reflection, a full night, alone, before God, ahead of one of the most consequential decisions of his earthly ministry. Whatever else is true about what happened later, Judas Iscariot was not a careless addition to the group. He was chosen the same way the other 11 were chosen, deliberately, prayerfully, by Jesus himself. Mark's Gospel lists the 12 by name, and Judas is there, last on the list, already carrying the description that would follow him forever. The one who betrayed him. It's almost unbearable to read, knowing what's coming. But strip that foreknowledge away for a moment and imagine the actual scene. A group of ordinary men, fishermen, a tax collector, and others whose backgrounds we know almost nothing about, being personally selected and named by the Son of God to follow him. Judas stood among them as an equal. Whatever was waiting at the end of his story, it didn't disqualify him from the beginning of it. There is one detail worth noting here, subtle but significant. Judas was very likely the only Judean in the group. The other 11 were Galileans, northerners, often looked down upon by the religious establishment centered in Jerusalem and Judea. Judas, by contrast, almost certainly came from Kerioth, a town in the south. From day one, in a small but real way, he may have stood slightly apart from the others, closer by birth to the very religious power structure that would later pay him. As the group's ministry developed, Judas wasn't sidelined or distrusted. He was given one of the most sensitive responsibilities any of the 12 held. John's Gospel tells us Judas kept the money bag. He managed whatever resources the group had to live on and to give to the poor. Think about what that role actually required. It meant the other 11 men, and Jesus himself, watched Judas handle their shared finances for years without apparent concern. That's not a position you hand to someone the group is wary of. By every visible measure, Judas had earned a level of trust most of us never fully extend to anyone outside our own family. And yet John's Gospel, writing after everything had already happened, adds something unsettling. When Judas objects to a woman pouring expensive perfume over Jesus' feet, arguing the money could have gone to the poor instead, John tells us plainly that Judas didn't actually care about the poor. He used to help himself to what was put into the money bag. It's the kind of detail that's easy to read backward, knowing what Judas would do later. Was this true of him from the start, or did something shift over time, and the Gospel writer is simply connecting dots after the fact? The text doesn't fully resolve that question, and it's worth sitting with the uncertainty rather than rushing past it. What we do know is this. Somewhere inside a man entrusted with real responsibility, something was already being mishandled long before the betrayal most people remember him for. For most of the Gospel narrative, Judas simply blends into the background, present, active, indistinguishable from the other 11. Matthew and Luke both describe Jesus commissioning the 12 with authority over disease and evil spirits, sending them out 2 by 2 to preach. Judas is included, no asterisk, no exception noted. This is worth pausing on because it's easy to flatten Judas into a man who was simply faking belief the entire time, performing discipleship while secretly plotting. But the Gospels don't actually support that flattened version. Judas appears to have genuinely participated in the ministry, possibly healing the sick himself, possibly casting out what the Gospels describe as demons in Jesus' name, the same as the others. He sat through the Sermon on the Mount. He watched 5,000 people fed from 5 loaves and 2 fish. According to John's Gospel, he was present when Lazarus walked out of a tomb 4 days after dying. Whatever was happening in Judas, it wasn't a man who'd never seen evidence. He had more direct, sustained access to the miraculous than almost any human being before or since. And it still wasn't enough to hold him. That's the part of this story that should genuinely unsettle anyone watching. The assumption that if we'd only seen what the disciples saw, we'd never doubt, never waver, never fall away. Judas is living proof that isn't necessarily true. Proximity to God is not the same thing as transformation by God. To understand why Judas's betrayal found a buyer at all, it helps to look briefly at what was happening among the religious authorities in Jerusalem. Because Judas didn't act in isolation, there was already a market for what he was selling. John's Gospel describes the chief priests and Pharisees growing increasingly alarmed as Jesus' following grew, especially after the very public resurrection of Lazarus. Rather than questioning whether Jesus' miracles validated who he claimed to be, the council's concern was political. If everyone believes in him, Rome will see a rising movement and respond with force against the entire nation. The high priest at the time is recorded as saying it would be better for one man to die than for the whole nation to suffer Rome's response. Whether he intended it this way or not, the Gospel writer notes that this was, in its own dark way, an unintentional prophecy. This matters for understanding Judas because it means his betrayal wasn't a lone act of moral collapse happening in a vacuum. There was already a structure in place, eager and waiting, ready to act the moment someone on the inside was willing to hand Jesus over. Judas didn't create the danger Jesus was in. He simply supplied what the danger had been missing: access. The Gospels are direct about the moment something shifted decisively in Judas. Luke writes plainly that Satan entered Judas. Language used sparingly across the Gospels, reserved for moments the writers considered spiritually decisive, not simply personal weakness or bad judgment. Matthew places this shift in close proximity to that same dinner in Bethany, after Jesus gently rebukes the objection to the costly perfume, explaining that the woman had anointed him in anticipation of his burial. It's a strange thing to consider. The same dinner that revealed Jesus speaking openly about his own coming death may be the moment Judas's path quietly diverged. If part of what Judas hoped for was a triumphant, conquering Messiah, a political liberator rather than a man preparing to die, that hope may have cracked precisely in this moment, hearing Jesus talk about his burial instead of a coming victory. Whatever the internal cause, the external action that followed is recorded plainly. Judas went to the chief priests and offered to hand Jesus over. Matthew tells us the price they settled on: 30 pieces of silver. It's worth sitting with that number for a moment rather than passing over it. 30 pieces of silver was, according to Old Testament law, roughly the compensation owed for a slave's life, not a fortune, not the price of a kingdom. A strikingly small, almost insulting sum for the betrayal of the Son of God, which makes any simple story about Judas acting purely out of greed hard to fully accept. Whatever he was chasing, it doesn't appear to have been wealth for its own sake. What unfolds next is one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the entire New Testament. At the table during the meal we now call the Last Supper, Jesus tells the 12 directly that one of them will betray him. The disciples' reaction, recorded across the Gospels, is confusion and grief, and notably, suspicion of themselves rather than each other. Each one, according to Matthew, asks, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?" Nobody points at Judas. Nobody seems to suspect him at all. Whatever was happening inside him by this point, it was completely invisible to 11 men who had spent 3 years at his side, eating, sleeping, and ministering together. John's Gospel adds a detail the others leave out, and it might be the single most haunting moment in Judas's entire story. Jesus identifies the betrayer quietly, not by pointing or accusing, but by dipping a piece of bread and handing it directly to Judas, a gesture that, in that culture, was an act of honor between a host and a deeply valued guest. Knowing exactly what Judas was about to do, Jesus extends that gesture to him anyway. Then, quietly, he tells him, "What you are about to do quickly." Judas takes the bread, rises from the table, and walks out into the night. There's no public confrontation here, no raised voice, no accusation in front of the others. Just one final act of honor, extended by Jesus to the man who was about to hand him over to die. And then Judas leaves. Later that same night, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas returns, this time leading a detachment of armed men sent by the chief priests. He knows exactly where to find Jesus, because he's been there before, on quieter nights, praying alongside the very disciples he's now leading soldiers toward. And then comes the detail every single gospel includes, as though none of the writers could bring themselves to leave it out, however painful it must have been to record. Judas identifies Jesus to the soldiers with a kiss. In that culture, a kiss on the cheek was an ordinary greeting between a devoted disciple and a respected teacher, an act of warmth, not threat. Judas takes that exact gesture and turns it into a signal for an armed arrest. Luke records Jesus' response, and it carries something closer to sorrow than rage. "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" There's a brief, chaotic moment that follows. Peter draws a sword and strikes a servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear, and Jesus, even now in the middle of his own betrayal and arrest, reaches out and heals the wound. It's a striking contrast to sit with. In the same few minutes, one disciple wounds out of fear and love, badly expressed. Another disciple delivers him to death, and Jesus responds to both with the same instinct, to heal rather than harm. Jesus is taken before the high priest and the council that same night, and eventually before Pilate. He's mocked, struck, and ultimately condemned to die by crucifixion, the standard Roman execution reserved for the worst criminals and political threats. This is worth naming clearly, because it's easy for the word betrayal to stay abstract. What Judas had actually handed over with a kiss was a man about to be beaten, humiliated, and nailed to a cross, to die slowly in public, as a deterrent to anyone else who might follow him. What happens to Judas after this is recorded slightly differently across the New Testament, and it's worth being honest about that rather than smoothing it into one tidy version. Matthew's Gospel tells us that once Judas saw Jesus condemned, he was seized with remorse. He returned to the chief priests, tried to give back the 30 pieces of silver, and told them plainly, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." The religious leaders refused to take the money back into the temple treasury, considering it tainted by what it had purchased, and used it instead to buy a field, afterward known, according to Matthew, as the Field of Blood. Matthew then records that Judas went out and ended his own life. The book of Acts, in a separate account, describes the circumstances around his death and the naming of the field, with some differences in detail, enough that scholars have long discussed how the two accounts might fit together. But both agree on the essential outcome. Judas did not go on to enjoy what he'd been paid. He did not disappear into comfortable hiding. His story ends, within hours of the betrayal itself, in death by his own hand. It's worth sitting with the specific word Matthew uses here. It describes more than simple regret. It points to a deep, almost crushing anguish. Whatever Judas had been chasing, by the end, he was clearly not indifferent to what he had done. He understood, immediately and completely, the weight of what he'd participated in. And this is where Judas's story becomes genuinely difficult to sit with, because his isn't the only failure that night. Peter, too, failed Jesus in the hours surrounding the arrest, denying that he even knew him, not once but 3 times, the final time with curses, according to the Gospels. 2 men, both among the closest friends Jesus had on earth, both failing him in serious ways within the same short stretch of hours. But their stories end in entirely different places. Peter weeps bitterly, the text tells us. And then he stays. He's present, frightened and grieving through the crucifixion. He's the one who runs to the empty tomb. He's restored by Jesus himself after the resurrection in a quiet conversation by the sea, and he goes on to become one of the central figures of the early church. The difference between the 2 men doesn't appear to be the size of what they did. Betraying Jesus to armed men and denying any association with him under pressure are both treated by the Gospels as real, serious failures, not one minor, one major. The difference seems to live somewhere else entirely, in what each man did with his failure once it was fully in front of him. One turned toward despair. The other somehow stayed close enough to be found again. It would be simple to file Judas away as history's obvious villain, the traitor, the man with the bag of silver, a name now used as shorthand for betrayal itself. And the Gospels don't ask us to excuse what he did. But sitting with his full story, from a deliberate calling on a mountainside at night, through 3 years of genuine participation in something extraordinary, to a final act that handed an innocent man to die, leaves something far more unsettling than a simple villain would. Judas had everything the other 11 had: the same teaching, the same miracles, the same 3 years at the center of the most significant story in human history, the same trust extended to him by Jesus right up until his final night in the form of bread offered by hand at a shared table. And somewhere inside that closeness, something else was also taking root. We aren't given a single tidy answer for what it was. Disappointment, perhaps. Greed, perhaps. A hope for a different kind of Messiah than the one who actually came. What we are given, clearly, is the shape of his ending. Real remorse, but remorse that collapsed inward into despair instead of reaching outward for grace. Judas's story stands beside Peter's as a quiet, uncomfortable question for anyone watching. Not really a question about Judas at all, in the end, but about what any of us tend to do in the moment we're finally forced to see our own worst failure clearly.